In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Inklings Review. I'm glad you came back this month, because this month we're dealing with one of my favorite books by one of my favorite authors, The Hobbit by JRR Tolkien. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the book, I want to give a little bit of background on the book. Tolkien was a perfectionist in his writing, but he was also a storyteller, and a lot of the stories that he would tell began as stories that he would tell to his children. This included other books of his like Farmer Giles of Ham or Rover Random. But for The Hobbit, this was one that expanded and slowly became infected by the larger literary and creative work that he tinkered with his entire life that we know today as the Silmarillion. The book, though, went from a story at bedtime to something being written down and being genuinely worked on. When he was grading essays one day, and as he was flipping through the boring, tedious task of grading essays, which I can sympathize with him as a teacher myself, one time there was a random blank page in the middle of the essay, whether on purpose trying to hit the page requirement and hope the teacher didn't notice, or by complete accident. But in a sudden burst, Tolkien began to write the famous first phrase that I just read to you. And in the hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. And from there he started to really build out this story. Now, some of the story, especially the early parts of the story, still have the hallmarks of a bedtime story. There's the asides by the narrator. But as the book goes further and further into the journey that makes up the book, his writing gets more serious, and it gets a little more into a more literary style of fantasy. And you can definitely see that by the heaviness of scenes toward the end, particularly like Thorin's last scene, where he speaks his last words. So it is a wonderful book that has this amazing background. And C.S. Lewis, when he read an early version of it, was over the moon excited, and he wrote a letter to his friend Arthur Greeves and said, Tolkien has written the kind of book that all three of us would have always wanted to read. And that's something that Tolkien and Lewis in particular really make a point of in their life. They wrote the books they wanted to read themselves. And The Hobbit is one of those great examples of where Tolkien's talents paid off because he embraced the subject matter he wanted to talk about. And some people even suggest that Bilbo, in some ways, is the burglar from Beowulf, and this is just simply Tolkien writing his own version of that story. So what is the rest of the story? Well, it starts off simply enough. There's a hobbit in a hole, and he's visited by a wizard named Gandalf, who seeks to send him on an adventure. And a group of dwarves show up on his doorstep trying to hire him as their burglar as they try and go retake their home, the Lonely Mountain. And that's about a dozen dwarves going against, 13 dwarves going against a dragon. So it doesn't seem like a really smart investment of time for Bilbo, but somewhat against his will, he is recruited into this adventure. And the book is very much a journey. They go from the west into the east, includes several famous anecdotes, the running into the trolls, meeting Elrond for the first time, the finding of the One Ring that becomes so important in Lord of the Rings, and then, of course, finally meeting Smaug the dragon. And this episodic nature, though, goes throughout, which really means it's wonderful to read because, hey, you're never going to be bored. All right, so what are some weaknesses of the book? This is a book for me that I love it so much, I'm really hard pressed to point out weaknesses. Uh, if I had to, there would be two that I would bring to mind. One is the anachronisms. Tolkien was famous for being a perfectionist. It took him over a decade to write Lord of the Rings. The Silmarillion was never published in his lifetime because of his efforts to make it just right. Yet he never purged the anachronisms out of the book. The hobbits very much are Englishmen, even if they are very short. And there's also little asides to go along with the narrator asides in the book. Famously, there's the invention of golf when describing the life of hobbits. So those anachronisms never quite get out of the book, and sometimes they can be jarring. The flip side of that, though, is they're also useful for, especially for children, for making it a world that they are seemingly know about and are comfortable with, but by the end they are completely absorbed into Middle Earth, and so those anachronisms are in some ways a weakness, but also a strength for bringing people into this incredibly in-depth world that Tolkien has created. The other one is the ending. C.S. Lewis was a little unsure about the ending himself. In the letter I referenced earlier, he said it was all great except for the ending. And a friend of mine once put it that the ending's not what was set up. What was set up was the confrontation with the dragon, and then suddenly there's another 5 chapters after the dragon, and there's this battle over the mountain, and doesn't seem like the payoff that you were prepared for is really what was there. So, to some extent, I think that's true, but we are we're going to talk about it here in a second. I think that misses one of the strengths of the book. Alright, so the strengths of the book. Now, The Hobbit is sometimes dismissed as a children's story. And that's true and it isn't true, because Tolkien did believe that, yes, you should tell stories for children, but that didn't mean he wrote down to children. And in The Hobbit, the strength of The Hobbit is the prose and the poetry that Tolkien used. It went everywhere from playful to serious, and it could make you laugh, and it could just about make you cry. So, Tolkien's style really elevates this from just another children's novel, and is why in the works he did that were very strictly not children's works, the Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings, why those books have really stood the test of time. Now, the other major strength, I think, for this is the episodic nature of the book. You don't get bored in the book. It's really out of the frying pan into the fire, except you're doing it every single chapter. So you're never really bored in this book. So if you have a short attention span, this is the kind of book you want to read. Now, the other really important strength in this is the character and development of Bilbo Baggins himself. Bilbo starts off as someone who's not experiencing life. He's literally watching it go by. And you can see that when he first meets Gandalf, and they have this discussion where it's really where he says good morning, and Gandalf kind of tears him apart because he means good morning in such a surface level way that there are 1,000 different meanings that good morning could have meant. But as you go through the book, Bilbo goes from being very hapless at the very beginning of the book, someone who was really out of his depths. But as you go, especially when you get to Mirkwood Forest in the book and you start to go toward the mountain, Bilbo starts to gain in stature, and really by the time you get to the mountain, Bilbo's more in charge of the group than Thorin is, even though it's his party and his claim to kingship over the mountain. Bilbo really has a much deeper understanding of what they should be trying to achieve by attaining this treasure, and it's not obtaining the treasure itself. It's about creating a good life. And that's what really Bilbo is after. And of course, that's what Thorin realizes when it's too late after the battle, and he is having to part from Bilbo for the last time as he is about to die. And I'll have to read the phrase so I don't get it wrong. But Thorin says, if more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. And that's the kind of themes that a lot of children's books don't typically try and delve into. But it's a pretty heavy scene, and because Tolkien sees these things as universal and children can handle it. And it becomes a gateway for a lot of people, including myself, into a larger imaginative world and what imagination can do. And of course, at the end of this book, I always have a smile of satisfaction on my face when I finish the last page. So how do I rank this book? There's no other option. It's 5 out of 5. So I cannot recommend it enough. If you haven't read this book before, go read it. If you have read it, go read it again. And that does it for us here this week on the Inklings Review. Please come join us next month when we tackle Owen Barfield's This Ever Diverse Pair. I know Barfield is one of the more obscure Inklings, but it's really one of the finest novels by an Inkling, so you got to come join us and check that book out. Make sure you like and subscribe before you head out. Join us here on the channel next week and every Sunday, as we have new videos every week. But make sure you come back and join us next month for the Inklings Review. Have a wonderful day.